Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am happy to be with you for another author interview. I hope you're having a great day. Hope that you have some good weekend plans, whatever they might be, staying in, going out. You know what? I talked to somebody. I know I talk about the weather, but I'm old, cut me some slack. I talked to somebody recently, and she was in Wisconsin, and she said it was negative 22 where she was. And I said, oh my gosh, it's currently 68 right now. And I felt bad because that is a 90-degree temperature swing. We don't need a 90-degree temperature swing. We could have met happily somewhere. She could have been, warmer. We could have been a little colder. I would have been happy to send her 30 degrees so that she could, although my husband would not have been thrilled with 38, 68, 30 degrees. He would not have been happy. He likes the 68 in January, but yeah, she was like, I'm going to move to Northern California or Florida or someplace where it's not negative 22. And that, of course, was before you factor in the wind chill. So, wow, I'm used to it. I grew up in Montana. You know this. I know negative zero, or negative zero. I know negative below zero weather. I know this, and I understand that it happens, and I understand that there can be huge temperature swings. But it still baffles me, flabbergasts me, amazes me when I think that, Wisconsin and California are not that far apart. But in terms of weather, that's pretty crazy. Random story, has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but just thought I'd throw that out there and apologize for the weather that I'm having. If it's a 90-degree temperature difference from the weather that you're having, I'm so sorry. Let's talk about a book, specifically the book Centered, Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams, written by Anthony Ianni and Rob Keast. Anthony is my guest today. Let me go ahead and give you the description from the back of the book. Sports fans will root for the underdog. Parents, teachers, and coaches will gain insight into the experience of an autistic child, and everyone will triumph in the achievements of Centered. They don't know me. They don't know what I'm capable of. Diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, a form of autism, as a toddler, Anthony Ianni wasn't expected to succeed in school or participate in sports, but he had other ideas. As a child, Ianni told anybody who would listen, including head coach Tom Izzo, that he would one day play for the Michigan State Spartans. Centered, Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams is the first-hand account of a young man's social, academic, and athletic struggles and his determination to reach his goals. In this remarkable memoir, Ianni reflects on his experiences with both basketball and the autism spectrum. Centered, an inspirational sports story in the vein of Rudy, reveals Ianni to be unflinching in his honesty, generous in his gratitude, and gracious in his compassion. So that is the story of, or the description on the back of Centered. And Michigan State University, I know this makes me, a total Montana dork, but whenever I see MSU, I think Montana State University, which is the rival of the school that I went to, University of Montana. And so whenever I see MSU, I think Bobcats, right? This is not the Bobcats, of course. This is Michigan State University. Completely different. Plus, my husband is a big Michigan fan, not Michigan State. I was confused the whole time I read this. Not confused, but like my brain kept really wanting me to go to other colleges in my head while I was reading this, and I had to keep reminding myself that it was not that MSU and it was not that Michigan. Completely different school. I think I'm tired. I sound all congested in the interview. I think that this never-ending sinus infection is just maybe it's affecting my brain, and I've gotten a little loopy. I think I've gotten a little loopy. Send help, y'all. Let's go ahead and turn to the interview with Anthony. I love this story. I love the way he tells the story. I so enjoyed this book, and I am excited to share this interview with you. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, the book is called Centered: Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. The author is Anthony Ianni. Hey, Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. We're going to talk about your memoir. It's called Centered, Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. But before we get to the memoir, if you could, this is actually kind of a funny thing because I'm about to ask you to share a little bit about yourself, but it's a memoir, so you can be sharing a little bit about yourself. But that's, let's start with just sharing a little bit about yourself in terms of who you are and, letting my listeners get to know you a little bit.
Absolutely. So I'm Anthony Ianni. I'm a national motivational speaker, self-advocate, and author. When I was 4 years old, I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, which is on the autism spectrum. And when I was 5 years old, a group of doctors and professionals had told my family that because I have a type of autism, I would barely succeed or achieve anything in my life. They told my family I would barely graduate from high school, never go to college, never be an athlete, and likely would end up in a group institution with other individuals like myself for the rest of my life. I wasn't told this story till my freshman year in high school, so that kind of became my motivation to go out and prove those people and then the other doubters and naysayers that had my life wrong. Had to work hard at everything, from basketball to my social life and especially school, because I'm not afraid to admit this, I wasn't the smartest kid that went to my high school. And I had a lot of support, whether it's from teachers, coaches, teammates, friends, and more importantly, my family. So I graduated from Okemos High School in 2007, where I then went on to Grand Valley State University for 2 years on a full scholarship for basketball. Things didn't quite work out for me there, so I decided to leave Grand Valley State to fulfill my ultimate lifelong dream, which was to play for Coach Tom Izzo and be a Michigan State Spartan. So I transferred to Michigan State, where I was a walk-on for 2 years. My senior year, Coach Izzo awarded me a full-ride scholarship. I was a part of 2 Big Ten championship teams, a team that won a Big Ten tournament title, a team that went to a Final Four. Got to play with a great group of guys who to this day I'm proud to call all of them my brothers. But during my time at Michigan State, not only did I graduate with a bachelor's degree in sociology, but I also became the NCAA's first Division I college basketball player with an autism diagnosis. So now as a national speaker, I get to travel all over the country talking about my story, my book Centered, and as well as doing transitioning in life with autism presentations, as well as anti-bullying presentations as well. So I'm very busy guy these days, especially with the pandemic going on. Doing a lot of traveling, so it's just been nice to get back at it lately.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable story, and actually some of the early chapters are kind of hard to read. Just because you can feel how hard it was for you just trying to live your little kindergarten life, or however old you were, and not understanding why people were being mean to you, or why they didn't understand why you were how you were, which was just your daily life. It was hard for me to read some of that, and to read some of the opinions of people who didn't think that you would be able to do anything, just dismissing it so quickly. You were only 5, mm-hmm. and they're like, well, he's never going to graduate. He's never going to do this. He's never going to do that. I know some of that has changed a little bit, but I can imagine that it just depends on where you live in terms of how people react to autism diagnoses, or, how much they understand. So as you've gone through the process, and this is a little off, this isn't quite about the book, but have you noticed improvements in school systems and the way IEPs are written and the way children with autism are educated?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, compared to where it was for me personally 25 years ago, I've seen, there are more resources, not just in certain states, but around our country. I mean, there's more ABA treatments and ABA therapies for young individuals with autism to go through. I mean, a perfect example would be, so I have twin nieces, my sister's kids, and they were diagnosed on the spectrum at a year and a half, because both were nonverbal, both didn't communicate really well. And they got into ABA treatment and therapy, and fast forward like almost 3.5 years later, one's talking up a storm, is interacting and playing with my kids nonstop. The other is still, she's starting to interact a little more. She's starting to communicate more and more. I mean, she said mom for the first time, like, in her life, like 8 months ago. And so just seeing what those kind of treatments and therapies do for my nieces just kind of showed me right there that, hey, we've come a long way away as far as where we're at from resources and everything like that. And I've seen it in schools too. Like I've seen it how schools are really stepping up their game as far as making sure that those young students, especially those with autism, they're getting the right resources and accommodations that they need to be successful in the classroom so they can be successful in the real world. And so, and like in IEPs, like I haven't been in an IEP meeting since my own, my senior year of high school, which was it'll be 15 years this fall. But I've heard how a lot of people are really stepping up their game to make sure that the IEP plans are followed to the T, that nobody's taking shortcuts, and that if something works, they stick to it. If something doesn't work, then they go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, if this didn't work with so-and-so, maybe this will. Let's see what happens. And so that's basically, what I've seen. Like we definitely have come a long way away from what I've noticed. But there's still room for improvement, just like with everything in life, whether it's your job or whether it's whether it's a sport or whatever, but there's still room to improve. But I mean, we're definitely on the right track. That's for sure.
Well, your nieces were certainly born into an incredible family too, because then, they recognize the signs. Obviously your sister kind of knew what to look for. And so that's wonderful that they're getting all the treatment that they need. I'm going to jump in here so we can take the first break of the podcast, but I did want to piggyback on the last comment and say toward the end of the book, Anthony writes, people ask him, what if one of your sons turns out to be autistic? What then? And he says something like, well, I'm certainly in a good position to be able to help them through that experience. And my family is certainly in experience. And so when he mentioned his nieces both have autism, I resonated with what he had said about his family, and reading the book, really, his family is so supportive and so willing to do whatever it takes to make Anthony's dreams, goals, ambitions a success. And so just, I just wanted to mention that comment and to say that it did resonate with me when he was talking about his nieces. So let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Anthony Ianni about his memoir, Centered: Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. Let's return to the interview. So again, the book is called Centered: Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. Can you talk about, obviously you're a speaker and you talk about this all the time, but then what went into the decision to write the memoir?
So it was just people getting in my ear. As I mentioned, I'm on the road a lot, speaking in schools, doing a lot of anti-bullying presentations for grades 3 through 12. And it was about 7-8 years ago, I was speaking at a school in Macomb County here in Michigan. And one of the principals came up to me and said, hey, have you ever thought about, putting your entire life story in print? Because, my students have only maybe heard 1/4 of your life story here today, but I really think they could benefit more and more from the other potential stories that you may have growing up dealing with bullies, from your autism diagnosis to where you're at today, and even your times at Michigan State. And she's a Spartan Michigan State grad too. And she was like, as a Spartan, I would love to hear more stories about Coach Izzo and behind the scenes, from Michigan State basketball. And my response was, I don't know, like I'm on the road a lot, 4 or 5 days a week. I don't know when I'm going to have time to do it. And so kind of fast forward a couple of years later, I sat down with somebody, a friend of mine. I was like, you know what, like, I think it's time. I think it's really time to start considering putting my entire life story into a memoir. And because I really think that not just, young students, but I think teachers, administrators, and parents, and those who are affected by autism, even self-advocates, can learn a lot from just my life story and just learn more about what autism is. And the one thing that love about the book is that, it's not just an autism thing, but it's a multiple, platform book. It could be autism, it could be sports, it could be people who are looking for hope and inspirational stories, it could be look for people who are looking for motivational stories to pick them up every day, people who just love a good underdog story. And so that was the one benefit about writing this book with my co-author, Rob Keese, was that we both knew that this book could really target multiple audiences, not just one specific audience with like the autism audience, but it could go beyond that. And that was one of the things why I also wanted to write this book, was not just to get my story out there, but to hit multiple audiences and target multiple people and educate them more about what autism is.
And how did so you have a co-author, Rob Keast. How did that relationship work in terms of writing the memoir?
Oh, it's fantastic. So I was actually introduced to Rob by my middle school resource room teacher, Susie Hall. So Mrs. Hall was my resource room teacher for 3 years in middle school before I went to high school. And when I was looking for somebody to help me write it, she immediately reached out to me and said, "Hey, you want to talk to my husband's cousin, Rob Keese?" And he's like, he's a Michigan State grad. He, got his degree in journalism. He's worked for different, magazine companies. He's worked for different publishing companies. Like, he knows a lot of authors. He teaches literature at Wyandotte Roosevelt High School, not too far from you. I was like, yeah, give me his number. I would love to meet him. So right when he and I first sat down, and we actually had lunch, that was our first meeting. When we sat down, we instantly connected. Like, not just because, we had a lot in common and, we're both Michigan State alums, but like, once Rob got a good understanding of my background and my story, and once he had more conversations with Mrs. Hall, like, he definitely understood, right away how impactful a story like this could be. And so we developed a plan together. We sat down, we did like 4 or 5 interviews, like, a couple months later, that were like 2-3 hours each. And just sitting there, Rob really got to understand me more. I got to understand him more about what he does and how he does things and what he likes to do. But he learned more about me and my background. So, but at the same time, when we did these interviews, like, it brought back a lot of memories for me. It really did. And so, but then, we would do the interviews, and then Rob would write up a chapter, and then I would read through the chapter, and he'd say, "Hey, what do you think if we add this in there?" And then I would come back and go, "Let's try put this in here in this part of the chapter and see how it flows." And so we really did a lot of tag teaming on this thing. And so he had a lot of conversations with my family, my parents and my sister. He talked to a couple of friends of mine as well, just to get a better flow and idea of things. So it's been a great partnership, and we're not done yet. I mean, he and I still have a couple more projects that we want to work on together again. And, so not only did it ended up being a partnership between us, but it ended up becoming a very good friendship as well that we continue to this day. And so, and I think the one thing that has really made our relationship and partnership really good is just the constant communication we have with each other, whether it's through emails, phone calls, and texts. Like, he would call me at like 10 o'clock at night, asking me, certain questions about things. I would call him at 11 o'clock at night and be like, "Hey, what do you think if we add this in the chapter? Or what do you think about this? The flow to me doesn't make sense here. What do you think if we did it this way?" And so, and that was the other thing. If somebody agreed on something, like, neither me or him snapped back at each other. Like, we listened to each other. We asked, why it didn't make sense or why things made sense. And so just having that constant communication is what really made our partnership, pretty darn successful, in my opinion, and why we both decided that we want to work on a couple more future projects together.
Can you talk at all about what those future projects might be? Or is that no?
So I don't want to get into too much detail, but right now, Rob and I, for our second project, we actually have interviewed. So what I told Rob what I wanted to do was, Centered is always going to be an incredible book for me because it's my life story. But I told Rob the second thing I really wanted to work on was kind of doing a project where, we interview athletes on the autism spectrum and their families and coaches and talk about their experiences, what worked, what didn't work, why it was successful, why it wasn't successful. and basically kind of make this like an educational book for coaches and teachers and young student athletes with autism, or even just young student athletes in general, to understand, what an individual with autism, an athlete with autism may go through on a daily basis. And not just that, but it could be a guidebook for coaches who may potentially have individuals one day that they may coach. And so, we've interviewed about, 15 different young athletes with autism, either current or former. And so, it's just been really fun to enjoy. And so, this is the kind of my niche, if you will. I actually had a conversation with Dr. Temple Grandin about this back in November. And, I've always told people, Sarah, like, she's kind of that person I want to have the torch passed down to one day, because just like what she does and the incredible things she does for the autism community, and just how inspirational she is to those in the community and outside the community, that's part of the reason why I got into this. What I do for self-advocacy and speaking is because of her. And I want to be that person that she passes the torch down to one day. And, she's known that for years. And so, we both co-headlined a conference in Nebraska 2 months ago in Kearney, Nebraska. And so we went out to dinner afterwards, and she was just asking me how things were going. And I told her kind of what I told you about my second project, that my co-author and I are working on. And she asked me what it was about. And I told her, and she just looked at me and goes, "That right there is your niche." She said, "My niche is science and cattle. That's why I've been so successful doing what I'm doing. But that could be your niche, is sports and autism. Like, that's something that nobody else from a self-advocacy and from a speaking standpoint has done. And like, you could really kind of take off from there because of the second project." She's like, "I'll endorse it for you. I'll do whatever you want." So for my mentor and one of my role models and icons in my life, for her to say that to me, it really meant a lot, because that told me right there, like, hey, Senator is always going to be there. That's not going away. But this second project could be really the one that kind of gets you to this point as far as your career goes, as far as like your niche and everything like that. So we're really excited. We're really excited to be currently working on this. And so it's going to be a while before we get it published, because obviously we're still in the early stages. But, when I told Rob about, working on the second project, he didn't even hesitate. And, the third project I would like to do, it might be a couple of years before I even started, is I do want to write a kid's book. That's my mom's dream right there, that she wants her son to do. And, I'm going to make my mom's dream a reality in a couple of years.
An overarching, that's awesome. I mean, there's so many awesome things in what you just said, from, your mentor relationship and the encouragement that you're receiving, but also then writing the children's book for your mom, because your mom was such a huge advocate for you. And I'm so impressed with your parents, and especially your mom, because she kind of had the day-to-day feelings, with you, and trying to figure out how to make it so that you could function in the world with everyone else. I don't want to just in a way that made sense to you. And I really appreciated that about her. What I like about the book is that it talks about, obviously, your experiences as a child and going through school, but what we don't often hear about is that autistic children become autistic adults.
Yep.
And, they kind of, there's a lot of focus on autistic children. That's great. That needs to be talked about, and how we can integrate them into education. But that doesn't stop once you graduate from high school or college, or,
Right.
Whatever it is that you want to do. So I really appreciate that your book focuses beyond even high school, and that you're doing this work, bringing awareness, because, you don't just stop being autistic.
No, you don't. You really don't. And that's the one thing that, I told Rob that I really wanted to hit home with, was that, I wanted to show folks that, yeah, just because I achieved all these great things in high school, and then achieved my dream and was able to do things in college that nobody ever thought would even be possible. Like, job's not, as Kobe Bryant once said in the NBA Finals in 2009, like, job's not finished. Job's not finished yet. So I'm always going to be, because people ask me all the time, like, do you still have autism? Like, is it gone? And I'm like, no, like, autism is always going to be a part of my life, no matter what. Like, you can't get rid of it. Like, and plus, like, I don't ever want to get rid of it, because I've always told people, Sarah, that if somebody had offered me a $5 million contract or a $10 million contract, saying, and in that contract it goes, we'll pay you $10 million if you try this cure for autism, like, it'll make everything in your life like be completely normal. You want to worry about the characteristics that you deal with on a daily basis being on the autism spectrum. All you got to do is sign it. It's $10 million and it's yours. And I would tell people all the time, like, I would rip that contract up in that person's face, because I'm proud to be on the autism spectrum, because autism is what made me into who I am today. Autism is what helped me make history, not once, but twice in my life. And that's why I've always encouraged people on the autism spectrum to be proud of who you are, because, I was just like those young kids at their age. I dealt with those early struggles in my life. I dealt with the loud noises. I dealt with the overload of crowd noises and arena noises. Like, I've dealt with so many different things in my life that I've had to overcome. But I look back on those times and go, you know what? I understand what those kids go through. I understand what this individual may go through. And so, but the one thing I'm most proud of is anytime I meet a young individual on the autism spectrum, whether they're high functioning or low functioning, and they hear about my story, like, it puts a smile on my face, because number one, it shows them that I relate to them, that I've been there before, I've done that, and that I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that they get the right help and resources that they need no matter what. And so that's the one thing too, Sarah, I've always prided myself on my whole life. And a lot of people, have always said to me, well, why would you even do that? And what I pride myself a lot on in my life is I put a lot of people before myself. I put others before myself, because I want to make sure that other people, whether I know them or not, are taken care of, and make sure they're helped out before I am. A lot of people think I'm crazy for that, because they've all said, well, try to be selfish in your life, do what's best for you, do what makes you happy. But I put so many people before me in my life that, I've taken a lot of great pride in that, and especially the autism community. And that's a community I'm always going to put before, anything else in my life.
Time for our second break of the podcast, but stick around, because we're going to talk about time travel, sort of. Not really, but stick around. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Anthony Ianni. I resonate with what you say. Something that I always find fascinating with, this is going to sound weird, but like sci-fi and time travel is, you change one little thing and it can change so much. And if you had changed not being autistic, you may not have been quite such a fanatic about going and playing for Michigan State. You might not have pursued that dream. And yes, your life could have been just as great, but that gave you that focus. And you really, you wanted to do that. You wanted to prove that. And in so doing, you played with Draymond Green. You ended up in Sports Illustrated. You did all those things that we kind of had a dream about. And you may or may not have done that had you not been autistic. And so I love that you see that as an asset, or, if not an asset, just something that's part of your life and that helps you, or, that affects how you see the world. Right.
Exactly. And, I call it more of a blessing than anything, because, I'm very Catholic. I'm not afraid to admit that, the good Lord blessed me with autism for a reason. And so, he puts me on a certain path in life for a reason. And, and you're right. Cause like one of my biggest strengths being on the autism spectrum is, when you give me something to focus on, I'm going to focus on it. And so that's why I was able to be so successful at basketball, in high school and in college, is that, when it came to the games or the practices, I was focused in I was zoned in the whole time. And so that's why I was able to have that success. Now, if I was on the autism spectrum, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't have had that focus, because I still would have focused. But I think being on the autism spectrum, made that focus level even more even better for me, to be honest. And so, but yeah, like I said, I'm always going to say, loud and proud that I'm proud to have autism.
Do you have advice for someone who may want to write a memoir, especially someone on the autism spectrum who might want to write about their experiences?
So my advice would be, find your reasoning and passion for that memoir or for that book, because, early on, when people were getting in my ear, like, oh, do this, do that, I was just like, I don't know. Like when I finally got my reasoning as to why I was writing my memoir, why I was writing, my book with Rob, when I finally got my reasons as to why, which was to get my story out there, to educate people more about what autism is, to continue to give people hope, motivation, and inspiration in the world today. When I had my reasons why, that's when I knew, okay, let's do this thing. Let's push forward. So my advice would always be, to young potential authors out there, especially those on the autism spectrum who want to write their memoir, write their story. Make sure you have your reasons for doing it. Like, don't just do it because you want to write a book. Don't just do it because you want to get your story out there. Like, do it because you want to educate people more about what autism is. You want to talk about your stories, your struggles, so people don't go through the same things that you may have gone through in your life. Or, teachers and administrators can learn more from your struggles. And so they could take your life story and bring them back to the classroom in the real world. And so make sure you have good reasonings for it. And because I know there are some out there that just want to make a buck or two, off their book. And, I didn't get into this to make a buck or two. That's the last thing I worry about, is like how much like my paychecks are going to be from selling my books. Like, I don't worry about that, because people ask me all the time, Sarah, like, oh, how the sales going? Where are you ranked at on Amazon? Is it a bestseller yet? And I'm just like, I don't worry about that. Like, if that happens, great, cool. I mean, that's another blessing right there for me. So I don't worry about that stuff. The only thing I worry about is, as long as people like it, as long as people are learning from it, as long as people get something out of it, whether it's just one thing, that's all that matters to me. And so, but, write your story and your memoir for your reasonings, and make sure you have a lot of love and passion when you write it out.
Thank you. Is there one particular story that you tend to highlight in when you speak with people, or is there one particular story from the book that you would like to highlight here? I don't know if it's kind of an overarching story, or if there's one specific story that you share more than others.
Oh man. I think for me, whenever I speak, like I talk about multiple stories that are in that book. But I think for me personally, I think my favorite from the book, I don't share it a whole lot, but I'm going to start needing to start sharing it more and more eventually, was the day that I received my full ride scholarship from Coach Izzo. And it was like 2 days before class started. And we had a team meeting, and he brought me in his office afterwards, and he looked at me and goes, I just want to let you know I'm 99.9% sure that you're going to be on scholarship starting tomorrow. And so I didn't know what to say. I just thanked him. He thanked me for all the hard work that I do, and just continue. He was like, just because this is part of your dream, you're on scholarship now, doesn't mean the work is done. Like, I need you to continue to do what you're doing. And so, but I remember just going to my car, and I got in my car, and I immediately just started sobbing, because, that moment right there had everything right there in that moment said and screamed, your dream is now officially a reality. Your dream was to be here at Michigan State and play for Coach Izzo, but it was also to be here on a full ride scholarship, and here you are. And so, but that story to me also resonates to the scene in Rudy, about Rudy Rudiger and Notre Dame football. Back in the early 90s, it was a great movie, and I still love it. And it's one of my favorites. And so there's a scene in that movie where he gets his final acceptance letter to Notre Dame, and he sits on a bench by the river there that just looks across campus and over at the Notre Dame Golden Tower there. And so the Golden Dome, they call it in South Bend. And so he reads it, he's accepted in Notre Dame, and he starts crying. And so that's a scene that I relate to right there. That was kind of like my Rudy scene, if you will. And so I know a lot of people have tried to compare my story to Rudy. Obviously, two completely different individuals, two completely different backgrounds and stories, but they are similar in a lot of ways. But that to me in the book Centered is one of my favorites because, you know, it compares those two scenes, those two moments, but it also really kind of shows like how important it was for me in that moment to be on scholarship and to finally see that my dream had been completely achieved for good.
Can you talk a little bit more about Coach Izzo for people who maybe don't follow college basketball or who don't live anywhere near Michigan and just talk about the importance of not only his place in your life, but also his place in the life of MSU?
Well, it's funny you say that, you know, if you're not from Michigan, you don't know who he is. Like I could tell you firsthand, Sarah, like I go to a lot of places. I've been to out in the middle of nowhere towns in Nebraska, and people know who Tom Izzo is, which is, I mean, it's crazy. But I tell people all the time, like Tom Izzo, outside of my father, is one of the greatest individuals I know in my life. Just what he does for players, past and current, how much he cares about them. Like, you know, Draymond Green had a saying, and the saying was, you come to Michigan State as a kid, and then you leave Michigan State as a man because of what him and his coaching staff do for you. Like, yes, they turn you into good basketball players. Some turn into great basketball players, but they also, him and especially Coach Izzo, he taught me more about life and character than anything. And I know that there are times where he's on the TV and he's like getting in guys' faces. He's like yelling at them, you know, pushing them all the time, like pushing them to be their best. I've always told people like that's Coach Izzo, the coach, because he wants his teams to be perfect. Like he wants you to play defense and offense perfect. He wants you to run the plays perfect, wants you to rebound perfect. So, you know, that's just Tom Izzo, the basketball coach. But Tom Izzo, the man, has taught me more about character than anything. He taught me how to not only respect others, but respect yourself. He told me how to treat others with kindness and respect every day, making sure that you represent yourself, that you don't just represent yourself every day, you represent multiple things in your life. You represent yourself, you represent your family, you represent your community, your high school, your university, everywhere you go. And that's why, like, I didn't go out and like, I didn't do a whole lot of partying or going out to bars during my time at Michigan State because, you know, when you play at a big time Division I basketball program like Michigan State, you're under a microscope and people want to see you fail, or they'll do anything to see you fail. And so he always taught me, you know, just to be careful with your surroundings. And so, you know, luckily for me, like I knew who my true friends were during my time at Michigan State. I made a lot of incredible relationships and friendships because of that. But just what he has done throughout his career, not just for the basketball program, but for Michigan State University in general. Like Sarah, he puts an entire university of staff, faculty, and students before himself. And that's the one thing I've always admired about him, is that he puts everything at that university before himself. And, you know, it's funny. There was one time I brought in a group of people to meet him one time, and they were just in awe. And one person commented saying, "Oh, this is like, it's like meeting the president or something." And Coach Izzo just goes, "I'm just a basketball coach. You know, I'm not the president or the governor or anything like that. Like, I'm just a simple guy who loves and has a great passion for what he does. I'm just a basketball coach." And when I heard him say that, I was like, you know, he's just like anybody else. You know, the only difference is he's one of the best basketball coaches in the world, but he's so humble and he makes sure that people are taken care of, whether it's his own players, his coaches, the managers, you know, our office secretaries at Michigan State, or the students at Michigan State, just whoever. Like, he just goes above and beyond for people. And so, you know, I've been so blessed in my life to known him for as long as I have. I mean, I've known him for, you know, 25 years now. Like I first met him when I was 8 years old, and I told him the first time I met him that I was going to play for him. And I think in that moment he was like, "Oh, that's cute. It's a little 8-year-old telling me he's going to come play for me in 10 years. But that became a reality. I mean, he recruited me in high school. He offered me a preferred walk-on spot right out of the gate, but he also encouraged me to take the full ride offer to Grand Valley State because he knew that, you know, free school is free school. It's going to change your life. And it did. And it was also a way for me to get, you know, out of town for a couple of years and just be my own person. And so, but he means a lot to me. And whenever he and I get a chance to talk and catch up, like, you know, those are moments that I always enjoy. And I always get at least one thing out of him, as far as like inspiration, or as far as like, certain comments he may make, I'm making sure that I continue to do what I'm doing. And so, but he's just been an incredible part of my life. And, I'm so blessed to not only call him, my coach, not only proud to call him a friend, but proud to call him like a father-like figure. Because that's what he is to a lot of us. He is a father to each and every single one of us because of just what he does for us and what he does for Michigan State University in general.
Thank you for that. I would imagine for you, it was pretty much a no-brainer to ask him to write the foreword. What was his reaction?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was definitely a no-brainer. I asked him, I actually called him and asked him, he goes, yeah, absolutely. Like I'd be honored to. And so he didn't even hesitate. And so for him to write the foreword and then for me to read it, it brought back a lot of really great memories. It really did. From the time I took his seat on the bus when I was 10 years old on a road trip to Minnesota, to, just days as a player, it really meant a lot to me. And I know a lot of people who read that, read Coach Izzo's forward are really going to realize that, just what kind of relationship like he and I really do have.
Time for our final break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Anthony Ianni. Are you a reader? Do you read for pleasure, or I always ask the question of my authors what they like to read. Do you have preferred genres or authors?
Oh man, so for me, growing up, I always loved reading John Wooden books. John Wooden, who coached UCLA to I could say 1,000 national championships, but I'm pretty sure it was like 11 or something like that. But just reading his books, when I was growing up in high school, just kind of like reading his philosophy, I really enjoyed that a lot. When I was in high school, we read, we read The Great Gatsby when I was in high school. I really thought that was one of my favorite books to read in high school, especially. So at times, like if I see like a really good, nonfiction, sports memoir, just like it doesn't have to be a sports memoir, just like a motivational memoir in general, like I'll definitely pick it up and I'll start reading it. So, cause what I like to try to do, Sarah, is I want to pick the brain, just pick, different ideas and kind of pick authors' brains a little bit about what they write and kind of get different input on things from other people's backgrounds. So, that's what kind of keeps my stuff, fresh from a speaking standpoint, is just reading about what other motivational speakers or athletes or even or actors may have been through in their life. So if it's anything nonfiction or anything memoir, I'm definitely picking it up and reading it. And it doesn't have to be sports. It could be people, it could be scientists, it could be actors, actresses, it could be, TV show hosts, whatever, because I want to try and learn about what other individuals have gone through in their life and what perspectives they have in life as well.
How about your kids? What are they reading these days? I'm totally nosy about what people read.
So my youngest is 4, so he's not quite there yet, but my oldest, he actually finished his first chapter book. It was like a short chapter book. It was Captain Underpants. So he's starting to get really big into those books now, but he's also been reading books about LeBron James. He's been reading different books about, dinosaurs and animals and tigers and lions. So what his teacher has done is, they bring a book home like every day from school, and then they'll read it, and he'll read it before he goes to sleep. And so, I mean, he's in all different kinds of things. So, but the last book he just finished up a couple of days ago was one of the Captain Underpants books. And he, I read those in elementary school, and he asked me the other day, like, oh, have you read these? I'm like, yeah, believe it or not, I read it when I was 10 years old. So about 23 years ago. So it's crazy for me to think how, I was reading some of those books when I was in elementary school, and now some of those books are still, relevant today, for my kids to read. And so it's just crazy to think how, I was in their shoes once and how he just loves to read. And so, that's the important thing to me, is that he loves doing something, especially reading. So that puts a smile on my face every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe Captain Underpants has been around that long.
I know, right?
It makes me feel a little bit old, but that's okay.
you and me both.
How about social media presence? Do you have a website for the book or for your speaking career? Where can people interact with you on the internet, on social media?
Yep. So I have my website, which is anthonyianni.com. The links to the book is on there as well. So if people want to buy the book, they can click on the links on my website. If they would like to see me speak, whether it's in their school, conferences, or events, I have a speaking request page as well that people can go to. They can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @AI44LYD. And on Instagram, my handle there is @AI GameChanger44.
So we've talked about the book. We've talked about a variety of things during our time together. Is there anything, though, that we haven't covered that you were hoping to talk about during this period?
I think we pretty much hit the nail on the head with everything.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you talking to me about your experiences, and especially about your book, Centered Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Thank you once again to Anthony for joining me to talk about Centered, as well as the work he is currently doing as a speaker for autism, an advocate for autism, etc. I have one random silly story for you as we're wrapping things up, and that is earlier my mother-in-law and my husband were talking about basketball. My mother-in-law is a huge basketball fan, and so she calls and they talk about games and players and what's going on, and I usually just kind of tune in and out because I don't know that much about specific games and teams, but they started talking about Draymond Green, and I wanted to pop in and be like, hey, oh my gosh, I just talked to this guy who wrote this book, and he played on a college basketball team with Draymond Green, and then my brain was like, shut up, nobody cares about your 4 degrees of separation. I mean, maybe they would have cared, but I was like, they're talking about basketball. They don't need you to jump in with your random. I just talked to a guy who knows a guy who did this thing. And actually, I'm sure my mother-in-law would have found that interesting, but the subject got changed and they started talking about something else, and so I didn't interrupt. But my brain is a weird place, y'all. I said it at the beginning, send help. But that's my story about however many degrees of separation that is. So thank you again to Anthony. Thank you, as always, for joining me to listen to another author interview. I hope you will join me on Tuesday. We're going to be switching to a romance novel, actually a series of romance novels, the Riches and Royals romances. They are by Kelly Z. Riley. The first book in that series is called Read My Lips, and so she will be joining me to talk about not only that book, Read My Lips, but also the Riches and Royals romances as a series. So join me for that. In the meantime, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the honor of leaving a review. That definitely helps. Written, starred, whatever is just easiest for you to do at any given point, but it does help us to get the podcast out to more listeners. Also, follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I love to hear from listeners. Let me know what's on your mind. And as always, hope that you are having a wonderful day, wonderful weekend, and I hope that your days and the week ahead involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.